You are breathing right now. You have been breathing since the moment you were born. Roughly 15 times per minute, 900 times an hour, 21,000 times a day, 600 million times across an average lifetime. And there is a very good chance that the breath you just took came through your mouth rather than your nose. If it did, you bypassed every system your body built for the job. A pharmaceutical factory, a gas delivery system, a precision air conditioner, and a pressure regulator that governs the chemistry of your blood. Your mouth can move air. That is all it can do. Your nose does 5 things to every breath before it reaches your lungs, and the physics of each one changes what the breath delivers to your body. There is a gas your sinuses manufacture continuously, a molecule that dilates your airways and your blood vessels simultaneously, that disappears entirely from the airstream when you breathe through your mouth. And there is a paradox in the chemistry of oxygen delivery, described in 1904, where breathing harder can deliver less oxygen to your tissues rather than more. Both of those mechanisms run with every breath you take. Whether they run correctly depends on which opening the air comes through. Start with the engineering, because the structure of the nose explains everything that follows. Look at a cross-section of the nasal cavity, and what you see is not a tube. It is an obstacle course. 3 pairs of shelf-like structures called turbinate bones projecting from the lateral wall into the airway, covered in highly vascularized mucous membrane, arranged to force incoming air through a series of narrow, curved passages rather than a straight path. The inferior turbinates are the largest, sitting low in the nasal cavity and handling the bulk of inspired air. The middle turbinates sit above them, and the superior turbinates, the smallest, occupy the upper reaches of the cavity near the olfactory epithelium. Each pair narrows the airway and redirects the airflow. The total surface area of the nasal mucosa, stretched across the turbinates and the septal wall, is roughly 150 square centimeters, folded into a space the size of a small fist. That surface area is the working area for everything the nose does to the air before it reaches the lungs. But the turbinates are not static structures. The vascular tissue underlying the mucosa, a dense network of venous sinusoids called erectile tissue, the same type of tissue found in the genitals, swells and shrinks on a cycle of roughly 2 to 4 hours, alternately congesting one side of the nose and decongesting the other. This is the nasal cycle, and most people have noticed it without knowing its name, the sense that one nostril is more open than the other, and that the dominant side switches throughout the day. The cycle ensures that each side of the nasal mucosa gets periods of higher airflow for conditioning efficiency, alternating with periods of reduced airflow that allow the mucosa to recover moisture and warmth. The engineering is self-maintaining. The system regulates its own capacity on a schedule the autonomic nervous system controls. What this architecture creates is specific and measurable. There is a number in fluid dynamics that predicts when airflow transitions from smooth to chaotic, and the geometry of the nose is built to cross that threshold with every breath. Air flowing through a simple tube at the velocities of normal breathing moves in laminar flow. Smooth, parallel streamlines with minimal contact between the air and the tube walls. Air force through the turbinate labyrinth transitions to turbulent flow, chaotic, swirling motion that dramatically increases contact between air molecules and the mucosal surface. The transition from laminar to turbulent flow is governed by the Reynolds number, the dimensionless ratio of inertial forces to viscous forces in a fluid. In the nasal passages, the combination of high air velocity through narrow channels and the curved geometry of the turbinates pushes the Reynolds number above the critical threshold, and the flow becomes turbulent. In the mouth, a wide, smooth-walled cavity with no internal structures to disrupt airflow, the Reynolds number stays low and the flow remains largely laminar. Turbulent flow is what makes the nose work. Every function the nose performs depends on maximizing the contact between the incoming air and the mucosal surface, and turbulence is the physics that achieves it. Thermal conditioning comes first. Incoming air, which may be anywhere from -20 to +40 degrees Celsius depending on where you live and what season it is, must reach the lungs at body temperature, 37 degrees. The turbinate mucosa is richly supplied with blood vessels running just beneath the surface, carrying blood at core body temperature. Turbulent flow forces air molecules into repeated contact with this warm, vascularized surface, and heat transfers from the mucosa to the air through forced convection. The same physics that makes a fan more effective than still air for cooling, but running in reverse. By the time air reaches the nasopharynx at the back of the nasal cavity, it has been warmed to within 1 to 2 degrees of body temperature regardless of the starting point. Air entering through the mouth reaches the lungs closer to ambient temperature, because the smooth-walled oral cavity generates far less turbulence, far less mucosal contact, and far less heat transfer per unit of air volume. Humidification runs simultaneously. The mucosal surface is continuously coated in a thin layer of mucus saturated with water, and the turbulent airflow picks up water vapor from this surface with every pass. By the time nasal air reaches the lungs, it has been humidified to approximately 95% relative humidity. Near saturation. The alveolar membranes, the gas exchange surfaces deep in the lungs, require this level of humidity to function. They are delicate, single-cell thick barriers across which oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse between air and blood. Dry air dehydrates these membranes, thickens the liquid layer through which gases must diffuse, reduces the efficiency of gas exchange, and triggers inflammatory responses in the airway epithelium. Mouth-breathed air arrives at the alveoli at ambient humidity, which in heated indoor environments in winter can be as low as 20% relative humidity. In a heated room in winter, mouth-breathed air arrives at the alveoli at humidity levels that stress the gas exchange surfaces the lungs depend on. Filtration is the third. The mucus layer coating the turbinate surfaces traps particulate matter. Bacteria, viruses, fungal spores, dust, pollen. Through impaction. Turbulent flow is critical because the chaotic trajectories of air molecules cause suspended particles to collide with the sticky mucosal surface at rates far higher than laminar flow would achieve. Once trapped, mucociliary clearance, the coordinated beating of millions of microscopic cilia, transports the debris toward the throat for disposal. Mouth breathing bypasses this entirely. Air enters the trachea carrying whatever was suspended in it, with no filtration step between the environment and the lower airway. The increased rate of respiratory infections in chronic mouth breathers is a direct consequence. The filtration system exists in the nose, and bypassing it delivers pathogens directly to vulnerable tissue. 3 functions: thermal conditioning, humidification, filtration, all dependent on a single physical principle: turbulent flow generated by the turbinate architecture. The mouth lacks the internal structures to generate equivalent turbulence, and without turbulence, none of these functions occur at the efficiency the lungs require. Every breath through the mouth is a breath that arrives at the lungs unconditioned, at the wrong temperature, the wrong humidity, carrying particles the turbinates would have caught. Those 3 functions alone would justify the existence of the nasal airway. But they are the engineering. What comes next is the chemistry, and it changes the significance of every breath. Your paranasal sinuses, the air-filled cavities behind your cheekbones, forehead, and the bridge of your nose, continuously synthesize nitric oxide. The enzyme responsible is nitric oxide synthase, expressed in the epithelial lining of the sinus cavities, converting the amino acid L-arginine to nitric oxide and L-citrulline in a reaction that requires oxygen, NADPH, and several cofactors. The synthesis is continuous. The sinuses generate nitric oxide around the clock, filling the sinus cavities with concentrations measured at approximately 100 parts per billion. John Lundberg at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm first measured this nasal nitric oxide in 1995, and the finding was unexpected. No one had predicted that the paranasal sinuses functioned as gas-generating organs. The prevailing view of the sinuses was structural. They lightened the skull, they resonated the voice, they were empty spaces prone to infection. Lundberg showed they were pharmaceutical factories, manufacturing a signaling molecule with every breath and delivering it directly into the airstream through every nasal inhalation. Every nasal breath draws a pulse of this gas from the sinus cavities into the main airstream, carrying it directly to the lower airways. The pulse is measurable. A nasal exhalation contains approximately 100 parts per billion of nitric oxide, compared to essentially zero in air that is entered through the mouth. The mouth has no sinuses, no nitric oxide synthesis, no gas delivery. The system exists exclusively in the nasal pathway. Nitric oxide in the airways performs two functions simultaneously. In the bronchioles, the small airways branching deep into the lung tissue, it acts as a bronchodilator, relaxing the smooth muscle in the airway walls through activation of soluble guanylate cyclase, which increases cyclic GMP, which triggers smooth muscle relaxation. The airway diameter increases. Resistance to airflow drops. More air reaches the gas exchange surfaces with less effort. In the pulmonary vasculature, the blood vessels surrounding the alveoli, nitric oxide acts as a vasodilator through the identical molecular pathway, relaxing the smooth muscle in the vessel walls and increasing blood flow through the lung. More blood reaches the gas exchange surfaces at the moment more air is arriving. The coupling is elegant. One molecule, delivered by the breath itself, simultaneously opens the airways and the blood vessels, optimizing both sides of the gas exchange equation with each inhalation. In measured terms, this means a 10 to 15% increase in oxygen uptake per breath during nasal breathing compared to mouth breathing. Not because the nose delivers more air, but because the nitric oxide improves the efficiency of gas transfer across the alveolar membrane by ensuring that air and blood meet in optimal conditions. Mouth breathing delivers air with no nitric oxide, no bronchodilation, no pulmonary vasodilation. Mouth-breathed air moves through narrower airways into less perfused lung tissue, and the oxygen transfer reflects the deficit. Consider what this means across a morning walk. A person breathing through their nose for 30 minutes is receiving a continuous nitric oxide pulse with every inhalation, airways dilating, pulmonary blood flow increasing, gas exchange optimizing with each breath. A person breathing through their mouth for the same 30 minutes is receiving none of it. The air volume may be similar. The oxygen extracted from that air is measurably different. Over 30 minutes, the cumulative difference in tissue oxygenation is enough to affect how the muscles feel, how the brain functions, and how much exertion the body can sustain before fatigue arrives. Across decades of partial mouth breathing, that per-breath deficit compounds into a measurable reduction in how much oxygen reaches every tissue that depends on aerobic metabolism to function. Nitric oxide was the chemistry the sinuses were built to deliver. What follows is the chemistry the blood was built to obey, and it runs in the opposite direction from what most people assume. Now, the paradox. And this is the finding that rewired how I understand what breathing is actually doing. Christian Bohr was studying gas transport in blood when he found something that contradicted what every physician assumed about breathing. He described the effect in 1904, and it overturns the intuition most people carry, that breathing harder delivers more oxygen. It does not. It can deliver less. The mechanism is the Bohr effect, the relationship between carbon dioxide concentration in the blood and hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. Hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. Each hemoglobin molecule binds 4 oxygen molecules in the lungs, where oxygen concentration is high, and releases them in the tissues, where oxygen concentration is low. But the release is not automatic, and it is not governed solely by oxygen concentration. It is modulated by carbon dioxide. In the presence of adequate CO2, the concentration that healthy metabolism maintains, hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen decreases. The molecule loosens its grip. Oxygen releases readily into the surrounding tissue. In the presence of low CO2, the condition created by overbreathing, hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen increases. The molecule tightens its grip. Oxygen stays bound. The blood carries it past the tissue that needs it without releasing it. Specific chemistry drives the effect. Carbon dioxide reacts with water in the blood to form carbonic acid, a reaction catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase inside red blood cells. The carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. The hydrogen ions bind to specific amino acid residues on the hemoglobin molecule and change its three-dimensional conformation. A physical reshaping of the protein that widens the cleft between subunits and weakens the bond between hemoglobin and oxygen, allowing the oxygen to release into the surrounding tissue. This is cooperative binding. Each oxygen molecule released makes the next one easier to release, which is why the hemoglobin-oxygen dissociation curve is sigmoidal rather than linear. Low CO2 means fewer hydrogen ions, less conformational change, a tighter cleft, stronger binding, reduced oxygen delivery. The Bohr effect is not a subtle modulation. A drop in arterial CO2 from the normal 40 millimeters of mercury to 35, a change that mild hyperventilation creates within minutes, shifts the dissociation curve leftward and measurably reduces tissue oxygen delivery. The blood is carrying oxygen, it is not releasing it. Mouth breathing drives the Bohr effect in the wrong direction. The mouth, with its wide open airway and minimal resistance to airflow, encourages higher breathing volumes, more air moved per minute, more CO2 exhaled per minute. Carbon dioxide is cleared from the blood faster than metabolism replaces it. The arterial CO2 drops. Hemoglobin tightens its grip on oxygen. Tissue delivery falls. The body senses the reduced oxygen delivery and responds by increasing the drive to breathe. Breathe more, breathe harder, get more air. But more air means more CO2 loss, which means tighter hemoglobin binding, which means less oxygen delivery, which means stronger drive to breathe. The cycle is self-reinforcing. You can be breathing harder, moving more air, and delivering less oxygen to your cells with every acceleration of the cycle. Most people have experienced this cycle without recognizing it. The moment of anxiety where the breath quickens, the chest tightens, and the attempt to take a deep, satisfying breath fails. The air goes in, but the relief does not arrive. The night when worry accelerated the breathing, and the acceleration made the worry worse. Because reduced tissue oxygenation from the Bohr effect creates genuine physiological distress that the brain interprets as evidence that the worry is justified. The breathing was driving the feeling. The feeling was driving the breathing. The mouth was open the entire time. Resistance breaks the cycle. The nasal airway, narrowed by the turbinates, requiring air to navigate the curved passages of the turbinate labyrinth, offers significantly higher resistance to airflow than the mouth. This resistance naturally limits breathing volume and slows the respiratory rate. Less air moved per minute means less CO2 exhaled per minute, which means CO2 levels stay in the range where the Bohr effect operates correctly, where hemoglobin releases oxygen efficiently into the tissues. The resistance that most people interpret as a limitation of the nose is the feature that makes breathing physiology work. The restriction is the mechanism. The nose would have prevented the cycle from starting. The mouth lets it run. One more mechanism, and this one connects the breath to the cardiovascular system through physics that operates at a specific frequency. Blood pressure oscillates. Blood pressure rises and falls in a rhythm governed by the autonomic nervous system's continuous adjustment of vascular tone, the degree of constriction in the smooth muscle of the arterial walls. This oscillation has a natural frequency, the Mayer wave, measured at approximately 0.1 Hz, corresponding to one complete cycle every 10 seconds. The frequency is intrinsic to the feedback dynamics of the Bohr reflex, the pressure sensors in the carotid arteries and aortic arch that detect blood pressure changes and signal the brainstem to adjust heart rate and vascular resistance. The system oscillates at 0.1 Hz because that is the natural period of the feedback loop between the sensors, the brainstem processing centers, and the effector responses in the heart and blood vessels. When breathing rate approaches this frequency, roughly 5.5 to 6 breaths per minute, compared to the typical adult rate of 12 to 20, a resonance effect occurs between the respiratory rhythm and the cardiovascular oscillation. Each inhalation temporarily increases venous return to the heart, raising stroke volume and heart rate. Each exhalation reverses the effect. At the resonant frequency, These respiratory-driven fluctuations in heart rate synchronize with the Mayer wave oscillations in blood pressure. The two rhythms locking into phase the way two pendulums on a shared beam eventually synchronize. Heart rate variability reaches its maximum amplitude, the beat-to-beat variation that indicates autonomic flexibility and cardiovascular health. Vagal tone, the parasympathetic modulation of cardiac rhythm through the vagus nerve, peaks. The baroreflex operates at maximal efficiency because the respiratory cycle and the cardiovascular cycle are amplifying each other rather than interfering. The resonance is reproducible. 5.5 breaths per minute through the nose consistently maximizes cardiovascular efficiency and autonomic balance across every subject tested. Nasal breathing, with its higher airway resistance, naturally slows the breathing rate toward this resonant range. The restriction forces each breath to be slower and deeper rather than faster and shallower. Mouth breathing, with its lower resistance and tendency toward higher volume, higher rate breathing, drives the respiratory rate well above the resonant frequency, into the 12 to 20 range, where no cardiovascular resonance occurs, where heart rate variability is lower, and where the autonomic balance tilts towards sympathetic dominance rather than parasympathetic recovery. Calm that arrives after several minutes of slow nasal breathing. The settling of the chest, the quieting that feels like it reaches deeper than relaxation, is cardiovascular resonance. The breath and the blood pressure oscillation have locked into phase with each other. The vagus nerve is running at peak activity, and the body has entered the autonomic state it was designed to inhabit. Anyone who has tried meditation or breathing exercises and felt something genuinely shift, a transition from effortful calm to a state where the calm seems to sustain itself, found the resonant frequency. The shift is not psychological. It is a phase law between two oscillating systems, measurable on a heart rate variability monitor, reproducible in any person who breathes at approximately 5.5 breaths per minute through the nose. Mouth breathing cannot achieve this effect because the rates it encourages are too fast to couple with the Mayer wave. 12 breaths per minute is twice the resonant frequency. 20 breaths per minute is more than 3 times the resonant frequency. At those rates, the respiratory cycle and the cardiovascular cycle operate independently. No coupling, no resonance, no amplification of vagal tone. The nose reaches the resonant range naturally because its resistance drives the breath toward the frequency where the coupling occurs. The narrowing is what makes the coupling possible. The same physics that governs the waking breath governs the sleeping breath. And during sleep, when conscious control withdraws, the consequences compound. Sleep apnea affects roughly 30% of adults over 65. The mechanism involves airway collapse during sleep, muscle tone in the upper airway decreases, and the soft tissue of the throat can obstruct the airway partially or completely, producing the snoring and breathing pauses that define obstructive sleep apnea. Mouth breathing during sleep worsens this directly. The mouth open position drops the jaw downward and allows the tongue to fall backward into the airway, a postural shift that narrows the pharyngeal space and increases the probability of obstruction. Nasal breathing keeps the mouth closed, the jaw in a forward position, and the tongue against the palate, maintaining a more patent airway throughout the night. Beyond apnoea, the airway physics of mouth breathing during sleep disrupts sleep architecture itself. Repeated partial obstructions cause microarousals, brief shifts from deeper sleep stages to lighter ones that the sleeper does not consciously register, but that fragment the normal progression through sleep cycles. Slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage, the one responsible for tissue repair, immune function restoration, and growth hormone release, is disproportionately reduced because it requires sustained periods of uninterrupted autonomic stability. Each microarousal resets the cycle. Less slow-wave sleep means less overnight repair, less immune restoration, and less growth hormone, the hormone that in adults governs tissue maintenance and recovery from the physical demands of the previous day. Anyone who sleeps 8 hours and wakes unrefreshed, who carries a fatigue that accumulates across weeks and months and years, who has attributed it to aging or stress or the general erosion of vitality, may be spending those 8 hours in lighter sleep stages, breathing through an open mouth, running the Bohr effect in the wrong direction with every breath. delivering less oxygen to a brain that requires stable oxygenation to maintain the deep sleep stages that restoration depends on. The clues are specific: waking with a dry mouth from 8 hours of unhumidified airflow, a sore throat from cold dry air irritating the pharyngeal mucosa, a headache that clears within an hour of rising, the signature of mild overnight hypoxia as the Bohr effect reduces oxygen delivery through hours of overbreathing. The nose was built to maintain a patent airway during sleep. The closed mouth position keeps the jaw forward, the tongue against the palate, and the pharyngeal space open. The resistance of the nasal airway slows the breathing rate, maintains CO2 levels, and preserves the Bohr effect in the direction that delivers oxygen efficiently. The body engineered a solution to the problem of breathing during unconsciousness. The solution is in the center of the face. 5 mechanisms, each one dependent on air entering through the nose rather than the mouth. The turbinate architecture generating the turbulent flow that conditions, humidifies, and filters every breath. The paranasal sinuses manufacturing nitric oxide that dilates the airways and the pulmonary vasculature simultaneously. The nasal resistance maintaining the carbon dioxide levels that the Bohr effect requires for efficient oxygen delivery. The slowed breathing rate approaching the cardiovascular resonant frequency where heart rate variability and vagal tone peak. The closed mouth jaw position maintaining the airway patency that uninterrupted sleep architecture requires. Mouth breathing bypasses all 5. The mouth is a backup airway, an emergency route for when the nose is obstructed by illness or injury. It was not built for continuous breathing. It lacks the turbinates, the sinuses, the resistance, and the postural mechanics that the nose provides. Using the mouth as the primary airway is running the backup system as the default, and the backup delivers a measurably different physiological outcome with every breath it takes. The shift back is available at any point. Closing the mouth and breathing through the nose. During the day, during exercise at moderate intensity, during sleep with positional adjustment, or, for some, gentle mouth tape. Restores every mechanism described above with the next breath. The nitric oxide pulse resumes. The turbinate conditioning resumes. The CO2 levels begin rebuilding toward the range where the Bohr effect operates correctly. The breathing rate slows toward the cardiovascular resonant frequency. The airway mechanics of sleep improve. None of these mechanisms require months of practice to activate. Each one activates with the next nasal breath and deactivates with the next mouth breath. The switch is immediate and it runs in both directions. 600 million breaths across a lifetime. Each one running through whichever opening you choose, the system your body spent millions of years engineering, or the backup that delivers raw air with no conditioning, no nitric oxide, no resistance, and no resonance. The physics is different with every breath. The chemistry is different with every breath. The oxygen delivery, the cardiovascular coupling, the sleep architecture, the pathogen clearance, all of it governed by whether the air came through the nose or the mouth. The body built the nose for breathing. The mouth was built for eating and speaking. The fact that it can also move air does not mean it should.